I'm now joined by John Cooper, the head of our public law team, to discuss the impact of judicial review on public service tendering. John, in order to avoid potential JR challenge, what issues should an authority consider before going out to tender?
Well, there's no obligation under public law to go out to tender, but there are lots of statutory obligations which do have a bearing upon whether you do so, what you have to do before you go out to tender, and what you have to think about before you go out to tender. So I think the first important point to answer your question is be aware of the statutory framework within which you operate. So to give an example, if you're in local government and you're a best value authority, you're almost certainly under a duty to consult under the Local Government Act 1999 as to your tendering arrangements. In the NHS, there are similar provisions. And for all public authorities, there will be the public sector equality duty, which always has a bearing upon thinking about contracting, how you go about the process of contracting, and what you're going to provide for in your contracts.
You mentioned consultation. So what issues does a public authority need to consider before going out to consultation?
Well, the courts recognise 4 main obligations on a fair consultation, and these are fairly well established now. So, first off, the consultation must happen at what's called a formative stage. In other words, when the decisions have not yet been made and the consultation is still a meaningful exercise. Secondly, when consulting, it's necessary to provide enough information and explanation as to what you're doing to enable consultees to give intelligent consideration and provide an informed response to the consultation. Thirdly, you must allow adequate time. Obviously, will vary depending on what you're consulting upon. And then fourthly, key point, once the consultation responses come back, the decision you make in response to them has to give what's called conscientious consideration to them. In other words, you must make sure that you have very thoroughly processed those responses and taken them into account. And all of those 4 obligations were originally set out in a case called Gunning back in 1985. So they've been law for about 30 years now. But only in the last couple of months has the Supreme Court formally endorsed them.
If I'm a private sector provider, do I need to worry about the public consultation?
Well, I think you do in at least 2 respects. Firstly, it's an opportunity for you to take advantage of. You're a private sector contractor, you're interested in tendering for the business, then you should also be interested in shaping the process, and consultation is your opportunity to do that. You are an important stakeholder in the process of consultation, so use that as an opportunity to shape the process to your advantage. The second reason you ought to be interested is because if you were to go through a process which was itself somehow unfair, even if you come out the other end and you turn out to be the successful tenderer, there is a risk that the process has to be unwound because the public authority is challenged on the basis of the unfairness of its process. So it's in your interest to make sure that it's done properly and correctly, and if you spot some flaws in the process, you might want to point them out, just so that there's no risk that you spend a lot of money in going through a process and then find at the end of it that the thing has to be unwound because there was some important procedural failure.
What about the scenario if you're a private sector provider and want to challenge the public authority's decision?
Well, do it quickly, and that's the key point. There have been plenty of cases in the courts over the years in which contractors have obviously, and for entirely understandable reasons, been reluctant to challenge a public authority. They want to stay on its good side because, after all, they want the contract that it's putting out. But then they see a ground of challenge, but they put it in their back pocket, wait until the end of the process, and only when they've been unsuccessful do they try and bring out that ground of challenge. And the courts are very, very reluctant to allow contractors to do that. What they say is that if you're in a process and you spot a failing, you should raise it immediately. You don't stay in the game, hope to win, and then you never have to mention it again. If you see the flaw, you raise it now, bring out the challenge at an early point. So the risk for you as a private sector contractor is that if you spot something and you don't mention it, and then you later want to raise it because you're unsuccessful in the tendering process, that you've lost your opportunity to do so, and the courts will not tolerate a late challenge.
Is there a prescribed time limit for doing that?
The standard rule is that you must bring the challenge promptly and in any event within 3 months. People often say 3 months, but it's important to be clear that that is not the timetable. The timetable is to bring a challenge promptly. And there may be occasions on which you bring a challenge within a 3-month window, but you're still considered not to have acted promptly. There is a variation for that in any case in which the ground of challenge turns on European law, in which a case called Uniplex says that in order to achieve certainty in European law, you need to fix a time period, and the courts in those cases will take 3 months as the fixed time period.
And is that time frame different from a procurement challenge?
Yes, I mean, these days the government has tightened up on the timescale for procurement challenges, and they have to be brought within 30 days.
So finally, what are the key points for in-house counsel to take away?
From a public sector point of view, probably 3 things. Firstly, make sure that you know the statutory framework within which you're operating, including statutes that you might not have to worry about every day, such as the Equality Act and the obligations of the public sector equality duty and how they bite upon contracting. You want to make sure that you have thoroughly factored all those considerations in before you go out to contract. The second point, which I think is fundamental on recent case law, is make sure that when you've thought about those obligations, you have a very clear documented audit trail of having done so. A number of challenges have been brought on the basis that people haven't had regard to their statutory obligations. Because they couldn't show an audit trail of having done so, the courts were willing to read the record against them and say, absent that documentation, they mustn't have had proper regard. And that in itself has been sufficient to ground a challenge. And then I think the third thing is consultation. The likelihood is that as a public authority, at least at some stages, you will be obliged to consult. It's very important to be familiar with the rules on fairness in consultation and to make sure that those have been followed, because probably failings in consultation are the single biggest ground of judicial review. From a private sector counsel's point of view, I would say, firstly, if you spot some failing in process, don't wait on it, don't wait to see what the outcome of the entire process is. Bring a challenge at an early stage. Raise it with the public authority concerned, and if they don't deal with it, be prepared to challenge then. If you don't use it within the earliest possible timescale, the likelihood is that you will lose that opportunity later. The second point, which I think is quite closely related to that, is even if you think you're in with a very good opportunity within this process, and you'd rather not rock the boat, it's a good rule of thumb for you to bring the attention of the public authority to any flaws that you see in their process. Because even if you're not likely to be the one who wants to bring a challenge, it may well be that other people do so. And it's of no use to you if you go through a process and you turn out to be successful, if somebody else then has a ground of challenge which causes the whole process to be unwound, by which time you and the public authority have probably gone through a long period of time and spent a lot of money. So a very good idea to help them to be legally correct. And then, of course, I think the final point for in-house counsel on the private sector side is it's your obligation in any tendering process to make sure that you understand the objectives of the tender and the criteria against which decisions are being made, and to submit all the evidence that you need against those criteria. Recent case law says that if there are gaps in your evidence, the public authority is entitled to read that against you, and they're under no obligation to assist you in putting the right evidence together.
John Cooper, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you.